Some men spend their lives collecting things. They gather land, gold, and power, building walls of wealth around themselves until they can no longer feel the sun on their own skin. They believe ownership is a measure of a man's worth, yet they are the poorest souls of all, for they own everything but themselves. Their hearts are vacant rooms, echoing with the hollowness of a life spent acquiring instead of living. Such a man was Sterling Vance. From the highest peak of his sprawling territory he could see for 100 miles, and nearly everything his eyes touched he owned. He owned the cattle that dotted the plains, the rivers that snaked through the valleys, and the timber that grew thick on the mountainsides. He commanded respect, and he commanded fear, but what he could not command was a single, honest, human connection. Every hand he shook was calculating. Every smile he received was a silent appraisal of his fortune. The women who sought his company saw only the gleam of his assets, their affection a commodity to be traded for security. Loneliness for Sterling was not an absence of people, but a crushing presence of their insincerity. It was a poison that seeped into his bones, leaving him weary and distrustful. One sweltering summer morning he stood on his porch, looking out at his empire of solitude, and made a decision. He would unmake himself. He would strip away the layers of wealth until only the man remained, and he would see what, if anything, that man was worth. He packed no money, only a small satchel with a loaf of bread and a flask of water. He dressed himself in the worn-out clothes of a hired hand, a faded shirt, patched trousers, and scuffed boots. He left his grand house, his name, and his fortune behind, and began to walk. He walked away from Sterling Vance, the landowner, and toward a ghost of a man, a drifter with no past and no prospects. His destination was a small, dusty town on the edge of his property, a place called Redemption Creek. He did not know what he was looking for, only that he could not find it in the life he had built. He sought a truth that could not be bought, a currency of the heart that he had never learned to trade. The sun beat down on his back, a raw and honest weight, and for the first time in years he felt something real. The town of Redemption Creek was forged from dust and desperation. Its buildings sagged under the relentless glare of the sun, their wooden faces bleached and splintered. The people who walked its single dusty street moved with a hard-won economy of motion, their eyes narrowed against the brightness and the general suspicion of strangers. Here, kindness was a luxury few could afford to spare. Sterling, arriving on foot and covered in the grime of his journey, was less than a stranger. He was a problem. He was a mouth without the means to feed it, a pair of hands without a promise of work. He felt their gazes pass over him, dismissing him in an instant. The invisibility was a new kind of poverty, sharper and more painful than the imagined hunger in his stomach. He had spent his life being seen for his wealth, and now he was not seen at all. He found a spot in the scant shade offered by the town well and sat down, letting a genuine exhaustion settle into his bones. He watched as people came and went, their buckets clanking. A blacksmith with arms like tree trunks drew water, his face grim with effort, not even glancing in Sterling's direction. A pair of women, their conversation a low murmur of gossip, filled their containers and hurried away, pulling their skirts aside as they passed him. He saw a flicker of pity in one woman's eyes, a momentary hesitation, but it was quickly extinguished by the pragmatism of the harsh land. Pity did not fill a pantry or mend a roof. He was just another piece of driftwood washed up on their shore. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down with a merciless intensity. His throat was parched, the dust a gritty film on his tongue. It was then that he saw her. She emerged from a small, unassuming building at the far end of the street, a place that served as both a home and a laundry. She was a young Chinese woman, perhaps 18, moving with a quiet grace that seemed to defy the oppressive heat. She wore a simple gray cheongsam, its fabric worn but immaculately clean. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and her face held a serene composure. She walked toward the well, her steps light and deliberate. He expected her to ignore him like all the others. He braced himself for the familiar sting of being overlooked. Instead, she stopped. Her gaze did not slide past him, but met his directly. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet observation. She saw not a beggar or a drifter, but a thirsty man sitting in the sun. Without a word, she lowered her bucket into the well, drew it up, and filled a small tin mug. She walked over to him and held it out. The tin mug was dented and worn, its metallic sheen dulled by years of use. But in that moment, it was the most beautiful object Sterling had ever seen. He stared at it, then up at her face. Her expression was calm, her gesture simple and profound. It was an offering without expectation, an act of pure, unadorned compassion. He reached out, his calloused, dirty hand trembling slightly as he took the mug. The metal was cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the day. For a moment, their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent a strange jolt through him. He lifted the mug to his lips and drank. The water was crisp and cold, a balm to his parched throat. But it was more than that. It felt like life itself, a baptism, washing away the dust, not just from his mouth, but from his soul. He drank it all, then lowered the mug, breathing deeply. He looked at her, searching for the right words, but they felt clumsy and inadequate. "You looked thirsty," she said. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper against the dry air, yet it carried with it a strength that resonated deep within him. It was a simple statement of fact, devoid of pity or condescension. "I am," he managed to say, his own voice sounding rough and foreign to his ears. "Thank you." He handed the mug back to her. She took it with a slight nod, her eyes holding his for a second longer, before she turned and walked back to her home, disappearing inside. Sterling remained seated by the well, the cool memory of the water still on his lips. That single act of kindness had anchored him. He watched the small laundry, a humble building that suddenly seemed like the most important place in the world. He learned her name was Alara. She lived with her elderly father, and together they washed and mended the clothes of the townspeople. Their life was one of relentless work and quiet dignity. He was captivated by her. It was not just her beauty, which was a subtle and powerful thing, but the deep well of integrity he had glimpsed in that one simple gesture. He knew then that he could not leave. He had to stay, not as Sterling Vance, but as the man to whom she had given a drink of water. He would call himself Jedediah. He would find work, and he would learn what it was to earn his keep, all for the chance to exist in the same small town as the woman with the tin mug. Under the assumed name of Jedediah, Sterling discovered the profound honesty of physical labor. He found work with a local rancher on the outskirts of town, a man named Arthur whose face was a road map of sun and hardship. The pay was meager, but the work was real. He spent his days mending fences. His hands, once accustomed to signing documents and holding reins of fine leather, now grew raw and calloused from handling rough-hewn posts and sharp wire. He cleared fields of stubborn rocks, his muscles screaming in protest, the sweat stinging his eyes. Each evening he would return to a small rented room above the stable, his body aching but his mind strangely clear. The fatigue was a clean thing, an honest exhaustion that money could never buy. His life became a simple rhythm of work, food, and sleep, but woven through it all was the quiet presence of Ilara. He would intentionally take the long route back to his room each evening, a path that led him past her family's laundry. He never intruded, never presumed to speak to her unless the occasion presented itself. He simply wanted to be a silent witness to her life. He would see her through the open doorway, her slender form bent over a steaming tub of water, or outside, hanging clean white sheets on a line. The sight of those sheets, billowing like sails in the gentle evening breeze, became a symbol of her quiet, persistent grace in a world of dust and toil. Their interactions were small and fleeting, yet they held immense weight for him. One afternoon, he saw her struggling to carry a large, heavy basket of wet laundry. Without thinking, he crossed the street and took it from her. "Let me help," he said, his voice low. She looked up, surprised, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you, Jedediah." She said his false name with such simple trust that a pang of guilt shot through him. He carried the basket to the clothesline for her, and they worked for a moment in comfortable silence, the only sounds the creak of the rope and the soft snap of the fabric in the wind. On the hottest days, a ritual began. He would find a tin mug of water sitting on the porch railing as he passed by. It was always there, waiting for him. She never said a word about it, and he never asked. It was their unspoken language, a thread of connection woven through the long, hot afternoons. He would drink the water slowly, savoring it, his gaze often finding hers through the window. She would give him a small, almost imperceptible nod, and it was enough. He cherished that tin mug more than all the gold in his vaults. It was a promise of something real, a testament to a kindness that asked for nothing in return. As weeks bled into months, the quiet respect Sterling felt for Ilara deepened into something more profound, an affection that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He had come to Redemption Creek to find a person who would see the man and not the fortune, and he had found her. But in doing so, he had built their entire connection on a foundation of deceit. The name she knew him by, Jedediah, was a lie. The poverty she saw was a costume. Every shared glance, every mug of water was tainted by the immense secret he carried. The guilt was a constant, heavy presence in his chest. He longed to tell her the truth, to confess everything and show her who he really was, but the fear of what would happen next paralyzed him. How could he explain that his entire life as a humble laborer was an elaborate test? It sounded cruel and manipulative. He imagined the look in her eyes changing from quiet warmth to cold betrayal. The Jedediah she knew and trusted would evaporate, replaced by the specter of Sterling Vance, the wealthy landowner, a man from a different world. She would think he had been playing a game with her, mocking her simple life and her simple kindness. The risk of losing her, of shattering the one pure thing he had ever found, was too great. His dilemma intensified as he watched her and her father struggle. The unrelenting summer drought was taking its toll on the town. The creek that gave the town its name was now just a trickle, and the main well was running low. Water, the very element that had first connected him to Ilara, was becoming a scarce and precious resource. With less water, people did less laundry. Ilara's business dwindled. He would see the worried lines on her father's face and the quiet anxiety in her eyes as she worked twice as hard for half the income. Then came the letter from their landlord, a greedy man from a neighboring county, informing them that the rent on their small property was being increased. Sterling overheard Ilara speaking to her father in hushed, worried tones. He saw the quiet despair settle over their small home. And he, Sterling Vance, stood by, a silent witness to their hardship, with the power to erase all their troubles with a single signature. The irony was a bitter pill. He had the wealth to give her a kingdom, but revealing it would destroy the small, sacred ground they had built together. To help them would be to expose his lie. But to do nothing, to watch them suffer when he could so easily intervene, felt like the greatest betrayal of all. Sterling could not bear to watch Alara's quiet strength crumble under the weight of circumstances he could so easily change. His inaction felt like a form of cruelty, a passive lie that was just as damaging as his active one. He wrestled with his conscience for days, the conflict tearing him apart. Finally, he resolved to act, but to do so from the shadows, preserving the fragile world he had built as Jedediah. He would use the power of Sterling Vance to protect the life he had made as a poor man. He told Arthur, his employer, that he needed to leave town for a few days to attend to a family matter, a vague excuse that raised no suspicion. He then traveled to a larger town miles away, a place where the name Sterling Vance was just a name, not a face. There he sought out a discreet lawyer, a man who valued gold more than curiosity. He instructed the lawyer to act as his proxy, to approach the landlord of Alara's property in Redemption Creek and purchase the outstanding debt and the deed outright. The transaction was to be anonymous, the benefactor described only as an old acquaintance of Alara's family, repaying a long-forgotten kindness from a generation past. The process was swift and clinical. With a few signatures and a transfer of funds, he erased the threat that had been hanging over Alara and her father. He held the deed to her home in his hands, a document that represented both his immense power and his profound deception. He instructed the lawyer to have a new, clear title delivered to Alara's father by a neutral courier. The entire operation felt surreal. He was moving vast sums of money, orchestrating legal maneuvers, all while dressed in the worn clothes of a common laborer. He was living two lives at once, and the strain of it was immense. He returned to Redemption Creek under the cover of darkness, slipping back into his small room above the stable, his heart a turbulent sea of relief and guilt. The next afternoon he watched from a distance as a man on horseback delivered a formal-looking envelope to Alara's father. He saw the old man open it, his brow furrowed in confusion, then in disbelief. He called for Alara, who came running out. Sterling watched as she read the document, her hand flying to her mouth. He saw tears of joy and relief stream down her face as she hugged her father. She looked around, her eyes scanning the street, searching for an explanation, for a face to thank. Sterling shrank back into the shadows of the alleyway, his own heart aching with a strange mixture of joy and sorrow. He had saved her. He had protected her. But he had also woven his lie into the very fabric of her life, tying her to him with invisible threads of wealth and deceit. Life in Redemption Creek settled back into its quiet rhythm, but for Sterling, everything had changed. The secret act of charity had created a new, more dangerous tension within him. He watched Alara, now free from the immediate threat of losing her home, and saw a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. But her relief was his burden. He felt the weight of her gratitude, an emotion she could not direct at him, and it was heavier than any rock he had ever lifted. A week after the deed was delivered, the delicate balance of his double life was shattered. He was hauling feed for Arthur when a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of a rider. The man rode a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to the tired workhorses of the town. As the rider drew closer, Sterling's blood ran cold. It was Vance, a neighboring rancher, and a rival whose ambition was matched only by his arrogance. Vance had always been envious of Sterling's success, and he was the last person on earth Sterling wanted to see. Vance reined in his horse, his eyes sweeping over the dusty town with disdain before they landed on Sterling. A look of utter disbelief crossed his face, followed by a cruel, mocking smile. "Well, I'll be," Vance boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sterling Vance, what in heaven's name are you doing dressed like a beggar and hauling sacks of grain? Have you finally lost your mind?" The name, spoken so loudly and carelessly, echoed through the quiet street. It was a name that carried the weight of legend in this territory, the name of the wealthiest, most powerful man for hundreds of miles. People stopped what they were doing and stared. Ilara, who had been at the mercantile just down the street, turned at the sound of the commotion. She saw Vance on his horse, and then she saw the man she knew as Jedediah, standing frozen in the middle of the road. Her eyes widened as Vance's words registered. Sterling Vance. The name was impossible, a phantom from another world. She looked at the man she had shared quiet moments with, the man who had fixed her shutter and carried her laundry, the man to whom she had given water. She saw the calloused hands, the sun-weathered face, and tried to reconcile it with the image of the phantom millionaire. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. His sudden appearance, his vague past, the miraculous and anonymous salvation of her home. It was all him. It was all a lie. Her face, a moment ago filled with a gentle warmth, became a pale, smooth mask of betrayal. The hurt in her eyes was a physical blow. Ilara, Sterling started, taking a step toward her, but she flinched back as if he were a complete stranger. She turned without a word and walked away, her back rigid, her quiet grace replaced by a wounded stiffness. He was left standing in the street, the dust settling around him, the weight of two worlds crashing down upon him. Later that evening, he went to her home, desperate to explain. She met him at the door, her face impassive. "Was any of it real?" she asked, her voice trembling with a quiet fury he had never heard before. "Or was I just a part of your game?" The exposure of his identity was like a dam breaking. The carefully constructed life of Jedediah was washed away, leaving only the stark reality of Sterling Vance. He could no longer stay in Redemption Creek. His presence was a spectacle, a source of gossip and unwelcome attention for Ilara. He returned to his grand ranch, the place he had fled in search of something true. Now, its vast, empty rooms felt like a prison of his own making. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. Every polished surface reflected the image of a man who had manipulated and deceived the one person who had shown him genuine kindness. The loneliness he had felt before was a pale shadow compared to the profound ache of this new solitude. He was surrounded by every comfort money could buy, yet he had never felt more impoverished. The memory of Ilara's face, her eyes clouded with betrayal, haunted his every waking moment. He would have traded all his land, all his cattle, all his gold, just to see the simple, trusting smile she once gave him. In Redemption Creek, Ilara retreated into herself. The town's whispers followed her everywhere. She was the poor Chinese girl who had been the subject of a rich man's bizarre experiment. The story became twisted in the retelling, painting her as either a fool or an opportunist. Her quiet dignity, the very core of her being, felt violated. The home that had been a source of such joy and relief now felt tainted, a gift born of pity and deception. She looked at the tin mug sitting on her shelf, the symbol of their first meeting, and felt a wave of shame. Had her simple act of charity been a mistake? Had she been naive to trust the quiet stranger? She and her father spoke of leaving, of starting over in a place where no one knew their story. The thought of running away was tempting, a balm for her wounded pride. But something held her back. This was her home. She had worked for it, cared for it, and she would not be driven away by the careless actions of a man who did not understand the value of the things he so easily toyed with. She continued her work, her movements becoming more precise, more guarded. She built a wall around her heart, determined that no one would ever breach it again. The separation was absolute, a chasm of wealth and mistrust that seemed impossible to cross. Sterling was trapped in his gilded cage, and Ilara was a prisoner of his lie. Days turned into weeks, and the drought held its grip on the land. The creek bed was a cracked, sun-baked scar, and the town well grew shallower by the day. Water rationing began, and the mood in Redemption Creek grew tense and desperate. From his ranch, Sterling watched the sky, hoping for rain that never came. He knew that apologies and explanations were meaningless now. His words were the currency of a liar. If he was to have any hope of redemption, it would have to be earned, not with his money, but with his hands. He had to become the man Alara thought he was, not just in appearance, but in action. He remembered a story his grandfather used to tell, about an underground spring that was said to exist on the barren stretch of land just west of the town. It was considered little more than a local legend, a hopeful myth. But Sterling had access to geological surveys and maps that no one else did, documents that suggested the legend might be true. An idea took root in his mind, a desperate, arduous plan. He could have hired a team of men, brought in drilling equipment, and solved the town's water problem in a matter of days. But that would be the Sterling Vance solution, an act of wealth, another grand gesture that would only deepen the chasm between him and Alara. This had to be different. This had to be the work of Jedediah. He loaded a simple pickaxe and a shovel into a small cart, and without a word to anyone, walked back towards Redemption Creek. He didn't enter the town, but went directly to the barren plot of land, a place everyone ignored. He chose a spot indicated on his maps, and he began to dig. The work was brutal. The ground was baked hard as stone by the relentless sun. At first, the townspeople who saw him thought it was another strange whim of the eccentric rich man. They watched with a mixture of scorn and amusement. But Sterling did not stop. Day after day, from sunrise to sunset, he was there. The sun beat down on his back, blistering his skin. His hands, which had just begun to soften again, were torn open, bleeding and raw. He worked with a singular, desperate focus. His world shrank to the rhythmic crash of the pickaxe, the scrape of the shovel, and the burning ache in his muscles. He was no longer pretending to be a laborer. He was one. The spectacle of the territory's wealthiest man engaged in grueling manual labor slowly changed the town's perception. Their mockery turned to silent curiosity, and then to a grudging respect. They saw that he asked for no help, sought no praise. He simply worked. Alara saw him too. From the edge of town she could see his solitary figure, a man waging a quiet war against the earth. She saw the sweat on his brow, the dirt on his face, the sheer, unyielding effort. And in that figure she saw a glimmer of the man she had first met, the humble, hard-working man she had offered a drink of water. The hole grew deeper. Sterling dug past rock and clay, driven by a hope that felt increasingly fragile. His body was a symphony of pain, but his spirit was resolute. This labor was his penance. Every swing of the pickaxe was an apology. Every shovelful of earth was an attempt to dig his way back to the man he wanted to be. He thought of Alara, of the quiet strength in her eyes, and he kept digging. The town had stopped whispering. Now they watched. Some would leave food and water at the edge of his dig site, anonymous offerings he would find when he stopped for a brief rest. He was no longer just Sterling Vance, the rich eccentric. He was the man who was trying to save their town with his own two hands. He was becoming a part of their community, not through his wealth, but through his shared struggle. Then, one late afternoon, after weeks of punishing work, it happened. The tip of his shovel struck something different. Not the dull thud of rock, but a soft, yielding dampness. He dropped to his knees, his heart pounding, and dug frantically with his bare hands. The soil grew dark and moist. A small, muddy trickle of water began to seep from the ground. He kept digging, his movements fueled by a surge of adrenaline, until a clear, cool spring bubbled up from the earth. Water. Life. He had done it. He sat back, covered in mud and sweat, his body trembling with exhaustion, and watched the small pool grow. A profound sense of peace washed over him, more satisfying than any business deal, more valuable than any fortune. Word spread through the town like wildfire. People began to gather, their faces filled with disbelief and wonder. They saw the water, fresh and abundant, and a cheer went up. They had been saved. They crowded around the new well, celebrating the miracle. Sterling remained on the periphery, his work done. He did not seek their thanks or their praise. He had not done it for them, not really. He had done it all for her. As the sun began to cast long, golden shadows across the land, the crowd parted. A figure was walking toward him, moving with a familiar, quiet grace. It was Elara. She walked right up to him, her eyes clear and searching. She looked at his blistered hands, his exhausted face, and the new well that flowed with life-giving water. In her hand she held the old dented tin mug. She knelt by the spring he had unearthed, filled the mug with the clean, cool water, and stood up. She walked the final few steps and held it out to him. It was the same gesture, the same offering that had started everything. But this time, it was not an act of charity for a poor stranger. It was an act of forgiveness, of understanding, of seeing the true man who had emerged from the earth. He took the mug, his hands shaking. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, the lies and the hurt washed away, leaving only the truth of his actions. "You look thirsty," she said, her voice soft and steady. He drank the water. It was the sweetest, purest thing he had ever tasted. "I was," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you, Elara." He had shed his fortune to find his worth, and he had found it, not in gold, but in the soil, in the water, and in a simple tin mug offered with love.